According to some of the old 49ers, it was early in the spring of '51 that George and Tom Spraggins located a claim on the Empire just where the Kicking Horse Creek joined the main stream. Free gold was plentiful in the loose gravel and denser cemented mass which underlay the formations of the creek. These ancient river channels have been a source of much speculation and effort on the part of the early gold seekers. They are the remains of a prehistoric time, and can be found all over the Pacific coast from the tops of the Sierra Nevada mountains, clear to the plains of the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. The Spraggins brothers were a source of mystery to most of the miners and prospectors about camp. They seldom mingled with the crowds in the barrooms and dance halls. The younger brother seemed to be only a lad with bright eyes, pink cheeks and curly fair hair, and his older brother always very careful not to allow him to do too much hard work up on the claim for which they called the Lost Log Mine. On their claim and up above high water, they built a dugout where they established a neat little home. It was far above the average of the rough and ready miner's cabin of the time. They seemed to take a great deal of pleasure during their leisure hours in repairing and beautifying their place of abode. The chinks between the logs were filled with clay, and it was rendered as comfortable and snug as a log cabin could possibly be made. Years went by. The brothers prospered. They drove a tunnel deep into the mountainside, following the ancient river channel. This yielded them goodly returns. Once a year, they would leave a caretaker to look after their property. They would go to either Sacramento or San Francisco for a few weeks for recreating and diversion, then when they would return, they would take up work of life with pick and shovel, rocker and pan. They were always together and never indulged in the usual hilarious pleasures of the frontier mining camp. Only coming to the store quietly for their supplies, making their necessary purchases and returning to their cabin with the modesty of decorum of Methodist deacons. The boys about camp frequently remarked about the peculiar actions and retiring dispositions of these brothers, but the ironclad law of the country forbade undue curiosity and unseemly questions. So the mystery of their aloofness and seclusion was never solved. After a time and through force of habit, the old-timers almost forgot them, hardly taking note of their goings and comings as they were peculiar fixtures which have become a part of the daily life of the wild frontier. Some 20 years had passed. The Spraggins brothers had grown older. Their fortunes had varied. The ancient river channel was like a side of bacon, composed of a streak of lean and the streak of fat. They would find rich deposits and then again would work for months, with only indifferent results. Some bad investments had relieved them of the great surplus of their early earnings. They worked on it, year after year. Until one morning, a cave-in. The tunnel caught the older brother George, crushing him. Tom, the younger and smaller brother, just escaped the avalanche of rock. He ran to the adjoining claim for assistance, for he knew that his brother and partner had, no doubt, had the life crushed out from him. Under the tons of earth and rock that had filled the tunnel. After many hours of desperate digging, the mangled and lifeless body was excavated from the debris, and the younger brother seemed absolutely prostrated with grief. George was buried on the little knoll near the cabin with a simple ceremony of the mining camp, and after a time the routine work of mining resumed. Tom, the surviving brother, was beginning to show the ravages of time and hard work. The back, that was once straight and slender, was now beginning to bend under the weight of years. Every Sunday he would place a bunch of flowers from the garden upon the grave of his brother George, whose memory seemed ever dearer as the years passed. Old Tom became quite a recluse, seldom appearing in the camp unless it was for provisions, which he bought in sufficient quantities to last him for months. The population of the mining camp changed, and some 20 years after the death of his brother George, very few of the old-timers remained who remembered the occurrence at the location of the last log mine by the Spraggins brothers. Along in the late 1890s, through some unaccountable accident, Tom was struck in the eye while at work in the tunnel by a piece of rock, which penetrated the ball, and destroyed its sight. For several weeks, he stayed about the cabin, refusing medical aid and suffering in silence. It wasn't until the inflamed eye gave him so much distress that he went to the hospital to have it removed. His actions in the hospital, while attributed to personal peculiarity, were the cause of much comment by the house physician and nurses. For the old fellow, grizzled and wrinkled, was too modest to allow himself to be seen in his entirety. He refused to remove all his clothing, using his blue flannel shirt and pepper and salt pants instead of a nightgown. He would take off his boots and socks, but these other garments he clung to with grim desperation. He was carefully examined by an oculist, and the eye was condemned for removal. The old fellow was insistent that only a local anesthetic be used, as he did not want to entirely lose consciousness. This was reluctantly agreed to by the operator and house physician, for they knew the operation would be painful. Among his other effects, the old man had a little old leather wallet, which he evidently prized above all other earthly possessions, for he kept it under his pillow, day and night. And on the morning of the operation, it went with him into the operating room. For what reason? No one knew. It was one of the peculiar whims to which the hospital attendants did not object, as they frequently had to humor the cranky notions of these old backwoodsmen and miners. The operation was started with a local anesthetic, but it was found impossible to continue and complete. Therefore, chloroform was resorted to produce that surcease from pain, which is such a boon to suffering humanity and material aid to the operating surgeon. The old man strenuously objected, but finally was over-persuaded and the anesthetic was begun. The old fellow did not breathe well, and his shirt front had to be opened to allow free muscular action. When, to the surprise of all present, instead of a man, the withered breasts of a woman were presented to view. The operation was completed and not a word of the secret was allowed to escape by the eyewitnesses. For some unknown reason, the woman had for years been masquerading as a man, living the wild free life of the frontier, delving long and hard in the earth for the precious yellow gold. Why all this had taken place, none present at the time knew or dared to question. So after a few weeks, Tom Spraggins left the hospital with the one remaining eye, to resume the lonely life in the cabin at the Lost Log Mine. One morning a few years later, the old fellow was missed by the neighbors. Investigation revealed the fact that he had been dead for several days. A coroner's jury was convened, and the majesty of the law made its ruthless examination. The effects of the old cabin were searched as with a fine-tooth comb, and in the little wallet that had been so carefully guarded during those long years, and during the sojourn in the hospital, were found the secret of their lives. They were old daguerreotypes. One of the handsome young man who was known as George Spraggins. One of a young lady about 16 or 18 years of age, dainty as a tea rose, beautiful as the dawn. And that of a little baby whose chubby face could give no hint of its relationship, it being but a tiny bit of humanity in swaddling clothes. The letters told a plainer tale. From these were gleaned the fact that George Spraggins had loved and married his pretty cousin Martha Spraggins, much against the will of the parents who forever disinherited them. That in due time a baby boy arrived to make their hearts glad with his sweet smile and winning ways. That the grim reaper diphtheria had taken the little one when he was not yet 1 year old, while the proud and happy father was away from home with the harvest crew. That grief at the loss of their baby, and other misfortunes, caused them to make up their minds to go west. In search of a new life amid strange surroundings, California was the ideal spot for them to begin life anew and to avoid questions and the possibility of imprudent intrusion of the rough element of the mining camp. They had agreed to go as brothers, work together and share the fortunes of life under the cover of masculine garb. Their plan had worked so well and their seclusion had been so complete that through all the years of their residence at the little habitation known as the Lost Log Mine, no one, not even the prying minds of a few women of the neighborhood, had penetrated the disguise. Tom was laid to rest beside the life partner, on the little knoll near the cabin. The kindly neighbors who, from time to time in remembrance of the faithful vigilance of the little brother, Tom, would place a bunch of flowers on the two graves. That the memory of love, as these two humans showed for each other, might be ever bright, in the annals of the little community.